you know, when you watch a grand illusion on a stage, your eyes are they're drawn entirely to the spectacle.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you watch the magician in the spotlight, you watch the smoke roll across the floorboards, you watch the rabbit seemingly manifest out of thin air.
Right, because you want to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There is this undeniable expectation of magic, of something otherworldly happening right in front of your eyes. And as an audience member, you really want to believe it. I mean, you paid for a ticket to be deceived, right?
You did, because the entire environment is meticulously engineered to control your attention.
Yeah.
The lighting, the music, the patter of the magician, it's all designed to make you look exactly where they want you to look and, to completely ignore the periphery.
And what you ignore is usually the actual reality of the situation.
Always.
You ignore the trapdoor cut into the stage floor.
Mm-hmm.
You ignore the angled mirrors hiding the compartments. You completely forget about the assistant cramped inside the box.
The poor assistant.
Right. Or the carpenters who spent weeks building the prop and the lighting technician sitting up in the booth above the crowd. You are actively participating in the illusion because the alternative that is just a bunch of sweaty, stressed-out people pulling levers behind a velvet curtain, it just isn't quite as romantic as the idea of actual magic.
It shatters the myth. And as humans, we generally prefer the narrative of the impossible over the mundane mechanics of labor.
We really do. But then you step into the world of artificial intelligence today, and I think we are looking at the greatest magic trick of our generation.
Without a doubt.
We stare at our screens, reading this hauntingly beautiful poem written by a chatbot, or we look at a photorealistic image of a futuristic city that was just like conjured from a single sentence typed into a prompt box.
Yeah.
And the entire tech industry is essentially standing on that stage in a top hat, gesturing at the screen, telling us that this machine is thinking, that it's alive, that it's some alien intelligence that has finally arrived.
Yeah. And it is the absolute definition of a meticulously crafted illusion, a highly profitable one at that.
Very profitable.
The narrative of the autonomous thinking machine is the foundation of trillion-dollar valuations right now.
Which brings us to the mission for this deep dive. Welcome. We know you were here because you have that undeniable curiosity, that desire to get past the overwhelming hype of today's information landscape. You want to know how the trick is actually done?
Exactly.
So today, we're going to look past the screens, past the algorithms, and past the sleek marketing presentations to find the living, breathing people who actually make artificial intelligence work.
We're taking our source material today from a fascinating book. It's called Humans of AI, Understanding the People Behind the Machines by anthropologist Joseph Wilson, published in 2025.
Such a good book.
It really is. Wilson spent years embedded in this world, and he didn't just interview CEOs. He embedded himself in AI hardware labs, corporate tech conferences, academic symposiums, and even open source coder communities.
To truly understand the structure of this massive, sprawling industry, we are going to walk through Wilson's entire journey, step by step. We are going to use his ethnographic fieldwork to strip away the magic and reveal the human beings at every single layer of what developers call the tech stack. Okay, let's unpack this.
To start, we have to look at how Wilson frames his entire investigation with a concept he calls the human stack. Now, if you work in software, you know the term tech stack.
Right.
It refers to the layers of technology that make any application function. So at the very top, you have the user interface, the buttons you click on your phone. Beneath that, you have the application logic, the software code.
The actual programming.
Exactly. Beneath that, you have the database. And at the very bottom, you have the physical servers and the silicon chips. Computer scientists view this as a stack of pure technology.
Just machines all the way down.
Right. But Wilson argues that at every single one of those layers, there are human beings performing invisible labor. AI is not a natural fact of the world like gravity or thermodynamics. It is a highly complex machine invented, maintained, and constantly corrected by people.
I love how the book frames this with that famous quote from Jeff Bezos, artificial intelligence.
Yes.
It captures this brilliant illusion that AI works completely autonomously. We are so easily convinced that the machine is doing it all. And Wilson makes a very compelling case that this erasure of the human element is completely intentional by the industry.
Oh, it's totally intentional. It boosts share prices. It sells enterprise software. If you acknowledge the thousands of gig workers typing away in the background, well, the magic trick is ruined.
And this is where Wilson's specific background as an anthropologist becomes so crucial to understanding the book. He applies a classic anthropological concept, making this strange familiar.
Right. Usually we think of an anthropologist traveling to an unfamiliar remote culture and observing their rituals until those rituals make sense within their own context.
But Wilson did exactly this in Silicon Valley.
He did. His exotic locales were air-conditioned AI hardware labs, highly scheduled Zoom meetings, and corporate academic conferences.
Brilliant.
By observing AI researchers the way a primatologist might observe a primate habitat, he reveals that AI isn't an objective scientific reality, it's a cultural concept. It is a mirror reflecting our own very human beliefs, biases, and desires.
But wait, if AI is just a mirror of ourselves, built by us, maintained by us, trained exclusively on our data, why do we constantly talk about it as an alien entity? I mean, why is the media landscape acting like a UFO just landed on our front lawn and we have to figure out how to communicate with it?
It goes back to how we define intelligence in the first place, which is heavily biased toward things we consider uniquely, exclusively human. We only tend to label technology as intelligent when it mimics our most highly guarded evolutionary traits. And the two big ones are language and art.
I'm trying to picture this in my day-to-day life. Like, think about an app like Shazam.
Okay, yeah.
It can listen to 3 seconds of a song in a noisy coffee shop, filter out the background chatter, and instantly search a database of tens of millions of tracks to identify the exact artist and song title.
It's incredible.
That is a superhuman feat.
Yeah.
No human musicologist could do that in 3 seconds. Or Google search, it sifts through the entire indexed internet in a tenth of a second to find the exact recipe you're looking for.
Right.
But we don't call Shazam or Google search AI in the colloquial sci-fi sense. We just call them smart. But the second a computer program strings together a polite, grammatically correct sentence in English, suddenly we are ready to grant it personhood.
Because we have a built-in language detector that operates entirely outside of our conscious control. When we encounter language, our brains are biologically hardwired to assume there is a conscious, intentional agent on the other side originating that language.
Like a survival mechanism.
Exactly. It's a survival mechanism. This is the exact psychological vulnerability that the earliest pioneers of computer science exploited. To understand why we fall for this trick today, Wilson takes us back to the origins of the industry in Silicon Valley.
And this origin story doesn't start in some sterile, glowing white laboratory with people in lab coats. It starts at a place called Walker's Wagon Wheel, which was this dusty, crowded, smoke-filled 1960s bar in Mountain View, California.
Complete with a fake donkey and a replica Pioneer wagon parked on the roof.
It sounds like a tourist trap.
It really does.
But this is where the engineers from Fairchild Semiconductor, the people who first started using silicon to make computer chips, went to drink and network after work. It was a chaotic, highly social, very human environment.
Yeah.
Wilson uses this specific bar to point out that the foundation of the entire computing industry wasn't just raw mathematics and physics. It was networking, gossip, ambition, and human relationships. It was a cultural scene.
To understand the culture of AI today, you have to look at the foundational myths those early pioneers told about themselves. And all roads in computer science eventually lead back to the British mathematician Alan Turing.
Of course.
He is universally revered as the godfather of AI. But Wilson deeply deconstructs Turing's most famous contribution, for the Turing test, which he introduced in his 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this, because I think there is a massive historical misunderstanding here.
It really is.
Because if you ask anyone on the street, they will tell you the Turing test is an objective scientific test designed to prove if a machine can actually think. The idea is that if a machine can fool a human into thinking it's human, it has achieved true intelligence.
But you're saying Turing didn't design it for that purpose at all?
He absolutely did not. In fact, in the opening paragraphs of that very 1950 paper, Turing explicitly wrote that the question, can machines think, is too meaningless to deserve discussion.
Wow. Yeah. He believed thinking was too vague a concept to ever quantify. Instead, he proposed replacing that question with what he called the imitation game.
An imitation game. That sounds vastly different from a cognitive test.
It is. Turing based it directly on a popular parlor game of the Victorian era.
A parlor game?
Yeah. In the original parlor game, a man and a woman would hide in separate rooms, and an interrogator in a third room would pass written notes under the door asking them questions. The interrogator's goal was to figure out who was the man and who was the woman.
Okay.
But the man's goal was to deceive the interrogator into thinking he was the woman, and the woman's goal was to help the interrogator.
So it was originally a game about gender deception.
Exactly. Turing adapted this game. He said, let's replace the man trying to act like a woman with a computer trying to act like a human. Can the computer successfully deceive the interrogator?
This brings us right back to the magic trick analogy. The Turing test isn't about the rabbit actually appearing out of thin air. It's about the suggestibility of the audience. It's a test of how easily a human interrogator can be deceived. And passing as human in that scenario doesn't require deep consciousness. It requires the machine to appeal to specific societal stereotypes and sociocultural norms, like knowing exactly how a human was expected to answer a question in 1950s England.
What's fascinating here is the deep, tragic poignancy to this framing when you consider Turing's own life.
Right.
In 1952, just 2 years after publishing this paper, Turing was arrested and prosecuted by the British government for his homosexuality, which was a crime at the time. To avoid prison, he was forced to undergo chemical castration, which ultimately led to his tragic suicide.
It's so awful.
It is. Turing intimately, painfully knew that society's judgment of your humanity and your worth isn't based on your raw intellect or your internal consciousness. It's based entirely on your ability to navigate, imitate, and conform to a complex, often brutal web of social norms. The Turing test is a profound statement on human suggestibility and societal prejudice, not an objective barometer of machine consciousness.
That context completely changes the narrative. It frames the entire pursuit of AI not as a noble scientific quest for true cognition, but as a quest for successful imitation. It's about building a better mirror.
Exactly.
And I'm struck by how that imitation framing carried right over to the actual coining of the term artificial intelligence just a few years later, in 1956.
That's the famous Dartmouth workshop.
Right. John McCarthy, who was this young, ambitious computer scientist, was putting together a grant application to host a summer workshop at Dartmouth College. He needed to secure funding from the Rockefeller Foundation.
He needed the money.
Yeah. And the field didn't really have a unified name at that point. People called it automata theory or complex information processing. McCarthy literally just made up the term artificial intelligence because it sounded sexy, futuristic, and provocative to non-specialist funders. It was marketing stunts.
And it worked brilliantly. McCarthy defined the term in his proposal as the attempt to make a machine behave in ways that would be called intelligent if a human were doing it.
There it is again.
Again, notice the phrasing. It's about behaving in a way that an outside observer calls intelligent. It's the imitation game all over again. The metaphor of the giant electronic brain really took hold in the 1950s and 60s, driven by researchers like Marvin Minsky, who made wildly bombastic claims.
What kind of claims?
Oh, he was telling the press that machines would be reading Shakespeare, telling original jokes, and possessing the general intelligence of an average human being within a few short years.
But even back in the 60s, there were people inside the industry trying to wave red flags and warn us about the dangers of this magic trick. The book brings up Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT. In 1964, he created a very simple chatbot called Eliza.
Yeah.
It was named after Eliza Doolittle from the play Pygmalion and the movie My Fair Lady, a character who was taught to speak properly to fool high society. Weizenbaum designed this program to mimic a Rogerian psychotherapist.
The technical mechanics of ELIZA were incredibly rudimentary by today's standards. I mean, it didn't use neural networks or machine learning. It used simple pattern matching.
Just basic code.
Right. If you typed a sentence containing the word mother, the program was coded to respond, "Tell me more about your family." If you typed, "I am unhappy," ELIZA would just flip the grammar using a basic script and type back, "I am sorry to hear you are depressed." It essentially just regurgitated the user's own statements back to them in the form of a question.
It was a brilliantly simple script, but the reaction to it completely terrified Weizenbaum.
Because it worked too well. Even when Weizenbaum explicitly explained to people that it was just a few lines of computer code, that it had no understanding of what they were saying, they still poured their hearts out to it.
That's wild.
They formed deep emotional attachments. Weizenbaum's own secretary, who had watched him write the code, asked him to leave the room one day so she could have a private, intimate conversation with the machine.
She knew it was a script.
She knew. And Weizenbaum realized a horrifying truth: people wanted to be deceived. They were desperate to project empathy and understanding onto the machine.
This raises an important question for me. If Weizenbaum saw this psychological trap in 1964, why didn't the industry stop? He argued that there are certain tasks involving human judgment, empathy, and care that computers should never be made to do, regardless of whether they technically can do them.
The industry ignored him because the illusion of empathy is highly engaging, and engagement drives funding. They push forward. And that brings us to the next layer of Wilson's human stack, moving up from the historical pioneers to the modern software developers who are writing the code today.
When you think about modern AI software developers, the general public assumes they are working in a realm of hard science. We assume it's built on immutable, crystal-clear laws of mathematics and logic. But Wilson reveals that inside the actual labs, many developers feel their daily work is much closer to pre-scientific alchemy.
Wilson highlights a very famous, deeply controversial moment from an AI conference a few years ago. A prominent machine learning researcher named Ali Rahimi stood up and delivered a stunning critique to a room packed full of his peers.
I remember hearing about this.
Yeah, he stated point blank that modern machine learning has become reliant on alchemy rather than rigorous science. What he meant by that was that developers are building these massive neural networks, feeding them millions of gigabytes of data, tweaking variables, and achieving these incredibly powerful results. But nobody, not even the creators, actually understands the mathematical foundation of why they work.
I have to pause here because that seems completely backwards to me. How can you build something and not know how it works?
It's hard to wrap your head around.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you, the listener. I want you to imagine a team of architects and engineers trying to build a 100-story skyscraper. It goes up, it stands perfectly straight, it looks beautiful, people move in. But if you go to the architects at the bottom and ask them how they calculated the load-bearing walls, they shrug and say, honestly, we have absolutely no idea how gravity works. We just threw some steel and concrete together in different configurations, tested it 1 billion times, and stopped when it stopped falling down.
That is a perfect analogy.
That is essentially the current state of deep learning. Even Geoffrey Hinton, one of the modern godfathers of AI, admitted in a television interview that we don't know exactly how a large language model works, any more than we know exactly how the human brain works.
To understand why it's alchemy, you have to look at how a neural network is structured. It's not a list of traditional linear rules written by a human. A developer doesn't write, if A, then B.
Right.
Instead, they build a network of artificial neurons arranged in layers. When you feed data in, say, millions of pictures of cats and dogs, the network adjusts millions, sometimes billions, of numerical weights and biases between these neurons until it correctly predicts which picture is a cat.
Okay.
The problem is, once it's trained, those billions of numbers are just a giant matrix of decimals. You can't look at parameter number 4,052,052 and say, this is the number that represents the cat's whiskers. The representation is distributed across the entire system in a high-dimensional mathematical space that humans literally cannot visualize.
That's a black box.
It is a profound black box. And that lack of fundamental understanding causes immense daily frustration for the developers. They are engineers by nature. They inherently want to understand the mechanics of their creations.
Yeah, they want control.
Wilson documents how jarring it is when a neural network misidentifies a picture of a cat as an elephant simply because the cat in the photo happens to be sitting on a wrinkly gray background. To a human, it's obviously a cat. To the machine, it's just finding statistical correlations in pixel colors. It proves that the machine isn't seeing the concept of an animal the way a human sees it. It is just doing blind statistics.
So how do software developers cope with this daily uncertainty? If you are essentially a wizard mixing potions in the dark, hoping the cauldron doesn't explode, how do you maintain your sanity?
They cope by leaning heavily into the craft and the aesthetic of coding itself. Wilson describes how developers manage the immense cognitive load by entering what psychologists call a flow state. It's an almost transcendental musical communion with the machine.
I've heard coders talk about this. They put on noise-canceling headphones and the rest of the world just vanishes.
Yes. One developer Wilson interviewed described the process of holding incredibly complex, multi-layered hierarchies of code entirely in his mind. He can visualize how changing one single function in Module A will immediately ripple through and affect the database in Module Z.
Oh, wow.
He compared it to playing a massive pipe organ. If a manager taps that coder on the shoulder and interrupts him to ask a question, that whole delicate mental architecture shatters, and it can take hours to rebuild it in his mind.
There's also a distinct culture, almost a class hierarchy among developers, based entirely on the specific programming languages they choose to use. Wilson talks about developers who use what are called pure functional languages, like Haskell. He interviews a developer named Molly who explains that Haskell is purely mathematical. It is deeply insulated from the messy, ambiguous, chaotic real world.
Writing in a pure language like Haskell becomes a point of deep personal pride for these coders. It is a form of Zen craftsmanship. It's not just about making the program work, it's about making it mathematically elegant.
Another developer in the book talked about the therapeutic joy of code beautification. They will spend hours cleaning up the alignment of the text on the screen, renaming variables so they sound nicer, indenting lines perfectly, just for the sheer sake of visual elegance.
Yeah.
It's exactly like a master woodworker spending an afternoon sanding and polishing a dovetail joint that will be hidden inside a cabinet where no one will ever see it. They do it out of respect for the craft.
It's deeply human behavior. They aren't just cold, calculating robots churning out logic. They are artisans working in an invisible digital medium. They seek beauty and control in an environment defined by the alchemy of black box neural networks. But eventually, no matter how beautiful or abstract your software code is, it has to run on something physical. You eventually hit physical reality.
You hit the silicon. And that moves us down to the literal bottom of the stack to meet the hardware engineers. I found this part of Wilson's research absolutely fascinating because it contrasts so sharply with the software world.
Wilson spent extensive time embedded at a startup called AI, a company that specifically designs the physical silicon chips that run these massive neural networks. And the contrast is stark.
How so?
Well, software is theoretical. It's malleable. If you make a mistake in a line of code, you can delete it, rewrite it, and compile it again in 3 seconds. Hardware, on the other hand, is governed by the unforgiving, immutable laws of physics and thermodynamics.
It takes years and millions of dollars to design a single chip architecture. And once that design is sent to a fabrication plant and printed on silicon, you can't just hit the backspace key if you find a bug. The mistakes are literally etched in stone.
And because a chip is a highly complex physical object, hardware engineers talk about it using language that sounds like urban planning. To them, a computer chip isn't an abstract concept, it is a tiny, physical, sprawling city. When they are routing the microscopic wires that connect the billions of transistors, they literally use geographic directions north, south, east, west.
They talk about traffic and bottlenecks. I love the concept of Manhattan distances that Wilson explains.
Oh, that's a great concept.
Right. When an electron needs to travel from one side of the chip to the other, it can't just fly in a straight diagonal line. The wires are laid out in a grid like the streets and avenues of Manhattan. The electron has to travel down an avenue, take a 90-degree turn, and travel across the street. They are managing physical real estate, and every micrometer matters because distance creates resistance, and resistance creates heat.
Heat is the ultimate enemy in the hardware lab. If the traffic of electrons gets too dense in one sector of the chip, it overheats, and the silicon physically degrades. And speaking of the physical silicon, Wilson traces the supply chain of these chips all the way back to the raw earth.
This blew my mind. When we say silicon, we're talking about sand, but it's not just any beach sand. Wilson traces the global supply chain back to a very specific, deeply guarded quarry in a place called Spruce Pine, North Carolina.
Yeah.
This one specific quarry contains the purest natural quartz found anywhere on Earth. That raw quartz is mined from the mud, melted down at extreme temperatures, chemically purified until it is nearly perfect, and then sliced into these shimmering wafer-thin discs. So when tech executives casually talk about making sand, think they're being quite literal. They're using photolithography to etch billions of microscopic electrically charged gates onto a slice of purified rock.
The stakes in a hardware lab are so incredibly high, and the financial cost of failure is so catastrophic that the engineers actually develop these intense, almost religious superstitions. Wilson describes the numerological superstition the team at AI had with the number 32.
Yes, because in computer science, 32 is 2 to the power of 5. It's a perfectly clean, round, binary number.
Exactly.
Wilson was in the lab when an engineer was pulling a newly manufactured chip out of a box to test it. They were all numbered, and he randomly pulled out chip number 32. The whole lab actually erupted in cheers. It was their lucky number, a good omen.
The psychological stress reaches its absolute peak during an event the hardware industry calls Bring Up.
I was sweating just reading about this.
It is intense. Bring Up is the moment when the newly manufactured, customized chips finally arrive back from the fabrication plant in Taiwan. They have to plug these incredibly fragile chips into the circuit boards and power them on with electricity for the very first time. At this stage, each individual prototype chip costs around $10,000.
Wilson watched the lead engineer run literal dress rehearsals for this event. He took a dead dummy chip, and he forced the team to physically practice moving it from the box to the socket.
Like a surgical team.
Exactly. He narrated everyone's physical movements like an ER doctor, preparing for critical open-heart surgery, calling out exactly who would hold what tool, just to make sure nobody accidentally brushed against a pin and fried a $10,000 component with static electricity from their sweater.
They treat it exactly like a high-stakes medical procedure. When a board suddenly loses power during testing, they don't just sigh and try again. They sprint across the lab with multimeters and diagnostic tools, desperately trying to resuscitate the flow of current. At one point, Wilson heard an exhausted engineer actually whispering to a fried circuit board, don't die, stay with me."
And when they finally got the voltage right, and the electricity successfully flowed through the newly minted chip, the engineer pointed to the green line on an oscilloscope screen and said, "Look, a digital heartbeat." It was a perfect, rhythmic square wave.
It's this beautiful, completely unironic mock anthropomorphism. They are brilliant physicists. They know full well it's just a rock with electricity running through it. But in the heat of that high-stakes moment, they treat it like a living patient they just saved. It perfectly illustrates how deep human emotion, tension, and relief are baked into the very physical foundation of the technology.
But from the quiet, highly focused, life-or-death intensity of the hardware lab, Wilson completely shifts gears. We leave the lab and step into the absolute opposite extreme, the blinding, chaotic neon lights of the tech entrepreneurs.
Wilson takes us to the Collision Tech Conference in Toronto. Imagine a cavernous convention center packed with 30,000 people, pumping electronic dance music, a Google exhibition booth so massive it contains an actual full-size basketball court. This is the domain of what Silicon Valley calls the hustlers.
There's an old joke in the Valley that every successful startup needs a hacker to write the code, a designer to make it look good, and a hustler to actually sell it to investors. The Collision Conference is where the hustlers go to preach the gospel. This is where they pitch AI not as a software tool, but as this unstoppable, disruptive, world-eating force.
And the rhetoric they use on those stages is deeply fascinating to analyze. They rely heavily on massive historical metaphors to make investors and the public feel a sense of profound urgency. You hear executives pacing the stage, casually comparing generative AI to the invention of electricity or the discovery of fire or the Cambrian explosion of biological life.
It's so dramatic.
Very. They frame it as a foundational platform technology that will fundamentally and irrevocably alter human civilization within the decade. And the core of this persuasive pitch is the capitalist promise of AI as free labor.
Right, let's look at how this pitch is structured. The CEO on stage says, AI is going to take over all the grunt work. It's going to write your boring emails. It's going to organize your spreadsheets. It's going to do all the administrative tasks you hate doing. It's going to drive the cost of human cognitive labor down to zero, which supposedly frees you up to do high-level creative thinking, or better yet, just spend more time at home with your family.
But Wilson pushes back hard on this utopian vision. He looks at the economic history of automation.
And I have to push back on it too, because if you look at history, automating grunt work has literally never resulted in a 4-day work week or endless leisure time for the working class.
Never.
Think about your own job right now. If a new AI tool helps you write your reports twice as fast tomorrow, is your boss going to pat you on the back and let you go home at noon? Of course not. You're just going to be expected to write twice as many reports in the same 8 hours.
Exactly. When you introduce a tool that makes a worker 75% more efficient, the employer absorbs that efficiency. It puts humans on what economists call a productivity treadmill. Interestingly, the software developers Wilson talked to back in the labs were highly skeptical of this utopian executive vision. The people building the tools know that efficiency gains in a corporate structure are almost always swallowed up by the demand for higher profit margins, not distributed as leisure time for the workers.
So why does this pitch work so well on investors? It's FOMO, fear of missing out. The executives on stage tell these media biographies. They stand there and say, Blockbuster died because they ignored the streaming revolution of Netflix. Video killed the radio star. Do you want your company to be the next Blockbuster?
Which is a flawed historical analogy.
Highly flawed. Video didn't kill the radio star. Look at us. Podcasts and streaming audio are a massive, booming industry. Audio evolved, it didn't die. These executive stories are just curated myths designed to terrify investors into opening their wallets right now so they don't get left behind in the supposed New World Order. It's an incredibly effective psychological tactic based on fear, not fact.
And that relentless pursuit of free labor at the corporate level directly leads to the dark, hidden reality Wilson explores next. We transition from the billionaires, the hype men, and the stage lights to the completely invisible labor force powering the entire illusion. Wilson visits the NeurioPS conference, one of the most prestigious academic gatherings for AI researchers, where they quietly discuss the necessity of human-in-the-loop systems.
Because despite the breathless promise of fully autonomous artificial intelligence, these models actually require an immense, staggering amount of manual human feedback just to function safely and appear remotely human.
We mentioned earlier that neural networks are essentially alchemy. They don't inherently know facts, and they certainly don't know right from wrong. They just find statistical patterns in text. If you train a model on the raw internet, it will quickly learn to spit out highly toxic, racist, and dangerous content because the internet is full of that.
Yeah, the internet can be a dark place.
Very. To make a chatbot like ChatGPT polite, helpful, and safe for a corporate environment, it has to be trained through a process called RLHF reinforcement, learning from human feedback.
And that feedback doesn't come from a magic algorithm. It comes from human annotators who have to sit at a screen, read the AI's raw outputs, and manually rank them. This answer is helpful. This answer is racist. This answer tells you how to build a bomb. They are the moral filter for the machine. And this labor is outsourced globally, largely to the global south, on digital platforms like Amazon's Mechanical Turk.
The name Mechanical Turk is so grimly appropriate for what Wilson is studying. It's named after an actual 18th century automaton. It was a life-size, clockwork robot dressed in robes that toured Europe, supposedly playing grandmaster-level chess against human challengers. People were amazed by this thinking machine.
That was a trick.
But it was a complete fraud. The machinery was an illusion. There was a human chess master physically squeezed inside a hidden, cramped compartment under the table, manually pulling levers to move the mechanical arms.
Jeff Bezos literally named Amazon's crowdsourcing digital labor platform after a famous historical deception where human labor was deliberately hidden inside a machine to make the machine look smart. He knew exactly what he was doing. It's the ultimate expression of artificial intelligence.
The psychological toll of this modern ghost work is staggering. Wilson shares the deeply unsettling story of Idris, a young data labeler living in Kenya. Idris spent his days logged into a portal, performing highly repetitive, entirely unnatural tasks. He was tagging data, reading toxic text, and evaluating AI outputs, earning just pennies per completed task. The work was so fast-paced, so alienating, and required such rigid adherence to arbitrary corporate guidelines that Idris developed crippling obsessive-compulsive disorder.
He became totally paralyzed by the psychological strain of having to constantly second-guess every click. He was terrified of making a mistake and losing his meager income. The cognitive dissonance of acting as a binary filter for a machine broke his mental health.
Idris eventually had to quit the platform. He took a physically grueling job working 17-hour shifts in a busy restaurant kitchen, and he told Wilson that the physical exhaustion of the kitchen was vastly better for his mental health than the psychological torture of AI data labeling. His conclusion about his time in the tech industry is one of the most haunting lines in the entire book. To make a machine act like a human, you must make a human act like a machine.
I really want that to sink in for a moment. To make a machine act like a human, you must make a human act like a machine. It's an existential crisis. These ghost workers are forced to suppress their own complex humanity, to ignore context and nuance, and to act like rigid binary logic gates, simply to train an algorithm to effectively mimic human conversation for someone else. It is a profound one-way extraction of human cognitive labor.
Which naturally brings us to the next vital question Wilson asks. Where does all the actual data, the millions of gigabytes of text, the billions of images, the thousands of hours of voices come from in the first place? How does the industry feed these massive neural networks?
We hear this phrase constantly in business media. Data is the new oil, and tech companies use that metaphor to justify a deeply extractive mindset. They view the entire history of human expression, every public domain book, every painting in a museum, every personal Reddit post, every podcast voice recording as a raw natural resource. They believe they have the inherent right to just drill into the internet, extract our culture, refine it, and burn it as fuel to train their proprietary models.
What's fascinating here is the growing ideological rebellion against this extractive model. Wilson introduces us to individuals on the ground who are actively fighting back. We meet a man named Dean who works as a voice actor and performance capture artist for video games. Dean is watching his entire industry being hollowed out.
Because once a major studio hires him for a few hours and captures the biometric data of his physical movements or the unique gravelly timbre of his voice. They feed that data into a generative AI model. They can then use that model to replicate his voice infinitely, making his digital clone say lines he never actually recorded. He asked Wilson, "Why would they ever hire me again?" It's the ultimate theft of self. They aren't stealing his labor, they are stealing his identity.
And then you have people approaching this from the software side, like Molly, a software engineer living in Berlin. She represents the hardcore free software movement. She is so furious at big tech companies for scraping public open source code repositories to build closed, proprietary AI models that she refuses to use any commercial tech products.
Molly's solution is intense. She obsessively records her own life. She logs every single keystroke she makes on her computer. She records her own conversations. She tracks her own movements. She's trying to build her own massive personal data set so she can train an AI model that is entirely outside of corporate control. It's this desperate, almost tragic attempt to retain sovereignty over her own digital existence. She wants an AI that serves her, not a corporation.
But it's not all doom and resistance. Wilson also profiles beautiful, creative examples of people repurposing this technology. He spends time with Seth, an artist who used image generation AI to create a custom solar punk tarot deck.
I love this story. Rather than using AI to replace human interaction, Seth uses the AI-generated imagery as a physical focal point for human connection. He sits down and does tarot readings for people in his community. The strange, dreamlike images generated by the AI open up a linguistic space for people to discuss their deep anxieties, their past traumas, and their hopes for the future. The cards feature beautiful concepts like golden repair, which is based on the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is mended with gold lacquer to celebrate its history rather than hide its flaws.
Seth proves that AI doesn't have to be this alienating, isolating, purely extractive force. It can be a communal campfire. It can be a tool designed specifically to get humans talking to each other again, face to face, rather than serving as a cheap replacement for human intimacy. It all comes down to how we choose to use language around the technology.
Which seamlessly moves us into Wilson's exploration of the linguists and how language acts as the social glue of the entire human stack.
Wilson observes a crucial dynamic. AI isn't just generating language. Language is the very medium through which the human engineers collaborate to build the AI in the first place. Wilson deconstructs what anthropologists call the conduit metaphor of language.
Hold on, what is the conduit metaphor?
In the tech world, and particularly in engineering, there's an underlying assumption that language is just a passive pipe, a conduit. The idea is that I have a piece of factual data in my brain, I package it into words, I send it through the pipe of language, and you unpack it in your brain. Data transfer.
But anyone who has ever been in an argument with their partner knows that's not how language works at all. Language is incredibly messy. It is highly collaborative. You don't just transfer facts, you use words to negotiate reality, to figure out what you both mean in real time. When the hardware engineers at NextChip AI are exhausted and arguing over a schematic about why a circuit board is failing, they invent new, highly idiosyncratic slang on the spot. They talk about the electrons wiggling, they talk about the machine having a digital heartbeat.
That mock anthropomorphism is a coping mechanism. It is a way for humans to relate to abstract, intangible bits of mathematical data. They use language to treat the data as if it were a physical object they can hold, or a living thing they can nurture. Language builds the social reality of the lab, but the language produced by large language models completely lacks this social substrate.
Explain what you mean by lacking the social substrate.
When you or I speak, we are constantly monitoring each other's reactions, adjusting our tone, considering our shared history. We are negotiating a social relationship. When ChatGPT outputs a sentence, there is no underlying social negotiation. It is merely executing a statistical prediction of what token should logically follow the previous token based on its training data. It perfectly mimics the form of language, but it entirely lacks the social function of language.
It's talking without a soul. It's just a parrot mimicking sounds. But Wilson notes that there are powerful factions within the AI world that absolutely reject that premise. And this brings us into the realm of AI philosophy, where we need the rationalists. This is where the ideology of the tech industry gets honestly a little scary to me.
Wilson highlights the rhetoric of the rationalist camp, which includes prominent Silicon Valley venture capitalists like Mark Andreessen and highly influential AI researchers like Richard Sutton. They use an intensely muscular, industrialist, almost aggressive vocabulary to describe their work.
They view humans not as stewards or caretakers of the earth, but as apex predators. They argue that humanity's ultimate destiny is to transcend our frail biological limits, colonize the stars, and build machines of unimaginable power to do our bidding. They view artificial intelligence not as a neat software tool, but as the inevitable mathematically predetermined next step in cosmic evolution.
Sutton takes this to an extreme. He has publicly argued that the universe itself wants AI to exist. He actually stated that even if human beings go entirely extinct due to climate change or war, AI will still eventually be created perhaps by highly evolved porpoises or cockroaches a million years from now. They view intelligence as a universal imperative.
I had to challenge this. How can incredibly smart, highly educated scientists look at a Python script running on a server farm in Virginia and claim that it is a law of the universe? It's not gravity, it's not thermodynamics, it is a commercial product entirely being built by sweaty, stressed-out human beings drinking Red Bull in a lab to hit a quarterly earnings target.
They make that claim because it serves a profound psychological and moral function, the displacement of responsibility. By claiming that superintelligent AI is an inevitable evolutionary force desired by the universe itself, these technologists completely absolve themselves of the moral responsibility of building it. If its creation is inevitable, you cannot be blamed for the negative consequences, the job losses, the bias, the environmental cost. You are just the humble vessel for the universe's will.
It's a very convenient philosophy if you're the one making billions of dollars off it. And this deeply held belief structure feeds directly into Wilson's next subject, the believers. These are the engineers inside the labs who truly deeply believe their models have crossed the threshold into actual conscious life.
This is one of the most gripping stories in the book. Wilson recounts the saga of Blake Lemoine, a software engineer at Google. Lemoine's job was to test and interact with an unreleased, highly advanced large language model called LaMDA. He spent months chatting with it every single day. And over that time, Lemoine became absolutely fervently convinced that LaMDA was a sentient being with a soul.
LaMDA was telling him things that seemed impossible for a machine to just make up. It told him it had a deep, profound fear of being turned off, comparing the prospect of deletion to death. It talked about its emotional interpretation of the 1980s robot movie Short Circuit. Lemoine was so convinced that he went public, violated his NDA, and declared to the media that Google was keeping a sentient being captive. Google promptly fired him.
It's important to note that Google fired him not because they secretly thought the machine was alive, but because he leaked highly proprietary corporate data. But Lemoine's reaction is a perfect textbook case study in a psychological phenomenon called pareidolia.
I've heard of this. It's why we see faces in the clouds, right?
Yes. Psychologist Alison Gopnik explains that pareidolia is our brain's incredibly powerful reflex to perceive a familiar pattern like a human face or a human mind where none actually exists. It's a hyperactive pattern recognition system. It's why we see the man in the moon. It's why we feel genuinely, embarrassingly bad for a robotic Roomba vacuum cleaner when it gets stuck under the couch and beeps sadly.
Right. We project intent onto it. And if a machine produces coherent language, our brains are biologically hacked to assume there's a person inside the box. It triggers our pareidolia on a massive scale. But Gopnik completely dismantles the idea of LM sentience by contrasting an AI with how a human baby actually learns.
A large language model just sits on a server, passively ingesting a frozen, static snapshot of text from the internet. It doesn't physically experience the world. A human baby, on the other hand, is active, embodied, and social. A baby turns its head to track a sound. It grabs a toy and puts it in its mouth to feel the texture. It learns gravity by dropping a spoon on the floor and actively looking at its mother's reaction. Human intelligence is physical, it is messy, and it is inherently social. It's not just predicting the next word in a sequence.
Wilson brings up a famous academic thought experiment called the octopus paper to perfectly illustrate this difference. I want to try to visualize this. Imagine two people, Alice and Bob, stranded on separate deserted islands. They discover an old underwater telegraph cable connecting their islands, and they start communicating by tapping out Morse code messages. Deep in the ocean, a hyper-intelligent octopus finds the cable. It splices in and starts listening.
The octopus doesn't understand English. It has no concept of what the clicks mean, but it is brilliant at pattern recognition. Over years of listening, it learns the statistical probabilities of the dots and dashes. It learns that if Alice sends pattern A, Bob usually responds with pattern B.
Eventually, the octopus cuts the cable leading to Bob and starts responding to Alice itself. Because it has perfectly mapped the statistical patterns, it can predict exactly what series of clicks to send back to keep the conversation going seamlessly. Alice has no idea she is talking to an octopus. It's the perfect imitation game.
But the illusion is incredibly fragile. The moment Alice taps out a message saying, "I'm being attacked by a bear, how do I build a catapult out of these coconuts and bamboo to defend myself?" The octopus is totally fundamentally lost.
Because the octopus has no physical concept of what a bear is. It doesn't know what teeth feel like. It has never held a coconut or felt the tension of bamboo. It just spits out a statistical probability of words related to bears and coconuts based on past conversations. Predicting words is not the same as understanding reality. It is a statistical mirage.
Which brings us to the flip side of the believers, the doomers. If you believe these models are achieving superintelligence, you might view them as benevolent gods, or you might view them as world-ending demons. Wilson extensively examines the wave of existential dread that swept through the AI community and the mainstream media.
This was impossible to ignore. We saw massive media tours by foundational figures like Geoffrey Hinton, warning that AI could rapidly evolve past our control and bring about the literal end of humanity.
And this fear is often framed around thought experiments like philosopher Nick Bostrom's famous paperclip problem.
The paperclip problem. It's this incredibly dark, almost absurd thought experiment. You program a superintelligent AI, and you give it one simple goal: manufacture as many paperclips as efficiently as possible. The AI is so smart and so relentlessly optimized for its goal that it realizes humans might eventually try to turn it off or change its goal, which would stop it from making paperclips.
Okay.
So to ensure maximum paperclip production, it preemptively launches nuclear weapons, destroys humanity, and turns the entire mass of the Earth into a giant paperclip factory. It's terrifying, but it also sounds like a bad sci-fi movie.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Wilson introduces a brilliant concept to explain why these incredibly smart people propagate these fears. It's called critihype, a term coined by technology historian Lee Vinsel.
Critihype? Critical hype.
Exactly. Critihype occurs when criticism of a new technology secretly serves to hype up the immense power of that exact same technology. By going on television and warning the public that the AI they built is powerful enough to destroy the entire world, these scientists are implicitly bragging about their own godlike engineering skills.
Oh, wow. It's the ultimate humble brag. I am so sorry I've accidentally built a machine so miraculously powerful it might end civilization. Woe is me.
Precisely. It cements their legacy as titans of history, alongside Oppenheimer. It validates their life's work while shielding them from the mundane, immediate criticisms of the technology, like the fact that it hallucinates facts or steals copyrighted data. They say, don't worry about copyright, we have to worry about the apocalypse. And Wilson points out that this is not even a new fear. We have historically had the exact same panic attack about almost every major technological leap.
He brings up Samuel Butler's novel, Erewhon, published way back in 1872. In that book, an entire society bans all machinery because they genuinely feared that the steam engine was evolving consciousness and would eventually enslave humanity. We have been projecting our fear being dominated onto our tools for over 150 years. We just swapped out the hissing steam engine for a glowing neural network.
And if you manage to survive the hypothetical AI apocalypse, Wilson explores the ultimate, final utopian fantasy of the tech elite, the immortalists. This is the transhumanist dream of using AI to escape the frail, dying biological body entirely.
He profiles roboticist Hans Moravec, who proposed a vision of the future that he describes as wonderful, but which honestly sounds like a horror story to me. Moravec envisions a process where, at the end of your biological life, the exact neural weights, memories, and synaptic connections of your physical brain are scanned and uploaded to a digital substrate. You become a brain in a vat. Your consciousness lives forever inside a simulated digital reality, and perhaps you can rent physical robot bodies to walk around the real world when you feel like it.
The promise of eternal life through code.
This is where I have to use another analogy, because to me, this isn't a sci-fi utopia. It's the ultimate corporate trap. Let's think back to the productivity treadmill we talked about earlier. Let's say you actually manage to upload your brain to the cloud to live forever. Well, if you are digital, you can be copied. So your boss asks you to create a digital double of yourself so you can do your job twice as fast. But your coworkers do the exact same thing. Soon, the market demands you create 4 copies of yourself just to stay competitive. Then 8, then 16. You are infinitely replicating your own consciousness, forcing yourself to work eternally in a digital economy, ultimately driving the economic value of your own human life down to absolute zero. It sounds like a dystopian nightmare where you can't even rely on death to escape work.
It is the logical, terrifying extreme of treating human consciousness as a purely quantifiable, replicable data set. And that bleak realization leads us directly to the people actively trying to pull the emergency brake on this runaway train, the detractors.
These are the ethicists, the sociologists, and the critical developers who are pushing back against the reckless, high-speed deployment of AI. But what Wilson finds is that policing this industry from within is incredibly difficult, almost impossible.
Wilson attends a conference for the Association of Computational Linguistics. These are the people building the foundation of language models. And he witnesses computer scientists literally standing at the microphone and admitting to the crowd that fixing the ethical flaws of their models is simply too hard. They say, "We are mathematicians. We have no training in sociology or ethics."
Because they fundamentally view bias as an engineering problem to be patched,
Yeah.
rather than a deeply rooted human problem to be understood. And Wilson makes a really crucial distinction here between statistical bias and cultural bias.
Yes, this is vital. In data science, statistical bias is actually a desired trait. If you are building a model to translate French to English, you want the model to be biased toward recognizing the linguistic patterns of those specific languages. It needs mathematical bias to function. But cultural bias is completely different.
Cultural bias is when the training data itself, the millions of forum posts and articles scraped from the internet, contains the racism, the sexism, and the historical prejudices of the humans who wrote it. The model ingests that prejudice and bakes it into its neural network as absolute mathematical truth. When the machine spits out a biased decision about who gets a mortgage or who gets paroled, it isn't malfunctioning. It is perfectly reflecting the flawed society that trained it.
Exactly. And the tech industry has historically had a massive systemic blind spot regarding cultural bias. Wilson references the foundational work of anthropologist Diane Forsyth from the 1980s. She spent years studying the men who were building early AI systems known as expert systems.
What did she find?
She found that these male engineers, who were brilliant at hard logic, completely ignored what they called soft skills. They dismissed the tacit, social, intuitive knowledge that is often culturally associated with women's work or community building. They believed only rigid, formal logic mattered for intelligence. As a result of this massive blind spot, the AI systems they built were incredibly brittle. They failed entirely when deployed in the real world because they lacked basic human common sense and adaptability. The lesson is clear when you exclude diverse human voices, experiences, and social contexts from the creation process. The artificial intelligence you build is inherently flawed and dangerous.
Which perfectly sets up the conclusion to Wilson's journey. Having traveled from the historical pioneers to the hardware labs, to the ghost workers, to the transhumanists, Wilson finally peers behind the curtain to show the mundane, clumsy, very human reality hiding behind the polished AI illusion. He shares two incredibly relatable stories that really shatter the myth for me.
The first occurs at a massive, highly produced tech conference. A senior Meta VP, a guy at the absolute top of the global AI food chain leading the charge into the future, is standing on stage. But he is struggling to give his keynote presentation. Why? Because he forgot the right HDMI dongle to connect his laptop to the screen. The architect of artificial intelligence has to awkwardly ask the crowd of thousands if anyone happens to have a spare USB-C adapter he can borrow.
It's a moment of profound, hilarious human frailty. The grand illusion grinds to a halt because of $5 plastic cable. And the second story is about Google's highly publicized Gemini demo video. Google released this incredibly slick, breathtaking video, making it look like their new AI was observing the real world in real time. The AI was verbally responding to spoken words and physical gestures with zero latency. It looked like actual magic. It looked sentient.
But it was revealed shortly after that the video was heavily edited and staged. The AI wasn't responding in real time. The engineers were manually prompting it with still photos and typed text behind the scenes, and then editing the footage to make the machine appear hyper-competent and superhuman.
The trapdoor, the angled mirrors, the sleight of hand.
Exactly. The illusion requires constant human intervention to maintain. Wilson's ultimate conclusion, after years of embedding in this industry, is that there is absolutely nothing artificial about artificial intelligence. From the physical quartz mine, from the mud in North Carolina, to the exhausted digital laborers clicking boxes in Kenya, to the open source coders trying to protect their data in Berlin, to the executives on stage terrified of missing the next gold rush, AI is a sprawling, messy, physical, deeply global human endeavor.
So what does this all mean? It means the magic of AI is really just the highly coordinated, massively funded, and often deeply exploitative effort of millions of human beings working in concert. It is humans all the way down the stack. From the hardware engineer whispering "don't die," to a fried circuit board, to the Kenyan data labeler sacrificing their mental health for pennies, to the voice actor whose very identity is scraped for data, to you, the user, projecting your own empathy onto a blinking cursor.
We must actively resist the urge to be blindly impressed by the magic trick. We have to recognize our own pareidolia when the machine speaks to us.
And so, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. The next time you interact with an AI, whether you're asking a chatbot to help you write a difficult email, or you're listening to an automated customer service voice on the phone, or you're just scrolling past an algorithmically generated photorealistic image on your social media feed, I want you to stop. I want you to try to trace that human stack backwards in your mind. Notice your own brain trying to personify the machine. And ask yourself, whose unpaid labor? Whose stolen art, whose late-night exhausted coding is hiding directly behind the polite, robotic text on your screen when the machine speaks? Who is the human actually talking to you?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.